Margaret Wellington stepped out of her rental car and immediately regretted wearing her expensive heels. The dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Montana stretched before her like something from an old Western movie. She pulled her designer blazer tighter against the cool mountain air and checked her phone. No signal, of course. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere," she muttered. Grabbing her leather briefcase from the passenger seat, Margaret had never wanted to come to this tiny town. But when her great-aunt Helen passed away last month, someone had to handle the estate. Her parents were too busy with their social calendar in the Hamptons, and her brother was closing a big deal in Tokyo that left Margaret, the successful marketing executive who supposedly had the most flexible schedule. She almost laughed. She'd been working 60-hour weeks for the past 3 years, climbing the corporate ladder at one of Manhattan's most prestigious advertising agencies. This trip to Montana felt like stepping into another world. The main street looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. A few pickup trucks were parked outside the local diner, and she could see cowboys in worn jeans and dusty boots walking along the wooden sidewalks. Everything moved slower here. Even the traffic lights seemed to take forever to change, though. There were only 2 cars waiting. Margaret walked toward the First National Bank of Cedar Ridge, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. She could feel curious eyes watching her from the diner windows. In her tailored suit and perfectly styled hair, she might as well have had "City Girl" tattooed on her forehead. The bank was a small, old-fashioned building with wooden floors that creaked under her feet. A middle-aged woman behind the counter looked up with a friendly smile. "You must be Helen Morrison's niece," the woman said warmly. "I'm Betty, the bank manager. Helen talked about you all the time. She was so proud of your success in New York." Margaret forced a smile. "Thank you. I'm here to handle the estate matters." "Of course, dear. Let me get the paperwork ready." Helen left everything very organized, bless her heart. While Betty shuffled through files, Margaret glanced around the small bank. It was nothing like the sleek financial institution she was used to in Manhattan. This place felt personal, almost cozy. Family photos sat on desks, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. The bell above the door chimed, and Margaret turned to see a man enter. He was tall and lean, wearing faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a well-worn cowboy hat. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, showing strong, tanned forearms. He nodded politely to her before approaching the counter. "Morning, Betty," he said in a deep, quiet voice. "Jake, good to see you. How's everything out at the ranch?" "Can't complain. Just need to make a deposit and check on that loan paperwork for the Johnson family." Margaret watched the interaction with mild interest. Small-town life seemed to revolve around these simple exchanges. Everyone knew everyone, and business was conducted with handshakes and genuine concern for neighbors. What surprised her was how Betty's entire demeanor changed when talking to this cowboy named Jake. There was a respectful tone in her voice, almost reverent. Other customers in the bank also seemed to notice him, offering quiet nods and friendly greetings. "Of course, Jake. Everything's ready for your signature. The Johnsons will be so relieved." Margaret raised an eyebrow. It was unusual for a ranch hand to be handling loan paperwork for other families. Maybe he was some kind of foreman or manager? For a larger operation, Jake completed his business efficiently, speaking in low tones with Betty about matters Margaret couldn't quite hear. She found herself studying him despite her general disinterest in country life. There was something different about him. He carried himself with quiet confidence, and when he spoke, people listened. "Have a good day, Betty," Jake said, tipping. His hat politely doffed as he turned to leave. His eyes met Margaret's briefly. She was struck by their intelligence and warmth. He touched the brim of his hat in a courteous gesture before walking out. "Who was that?" Margaret asked, more curious than she wanted to admit. "Oh, that's Jake Morrison. His family's been here for generations. Salt of the earth, that one." Betty's voice carried obvious admiration. "Morrison, the same last name as her." "Aunt." Margaret made a mental note to ask about the connection later. "Now, about your aunt's estate," Betty continued, spreading papers across the counter. Helen owned the old Victorian house on Maple Street, plus about 10 acres of land. There's also a small savings account and some investments, nothing too complicated. Margaret reviewed the documents, her business mind automatically calculating values and tax implications. The house would need repairs before it could be sold, and the land might have some value to local developers. Is there much of a real estate market here? She asked. Well, it depends. Land around here can be valuable, especially if it has water rights or borders the national forest. Your aunt's property is nice, but it's not like some of the bigger spreads. Bigger spreads? The cattle ranches? Some of them cover thousands of acres. The Morrison Ranch, for instance, is enormous. Been in Jake's family since the 1800s? Margaret filed this information away. So the cowboy she'd just met came from an established ranching family. That explained the respect people showed him. Over the next hour, Betty walked her through all the legal requirements and paperwork. Margaret's efficient city mind appreciated having everything clearly organized, even if the pace was much slower than she was used to. You'll need to visit the courthouse to transfer the deed, Betty explained. And the insurance company has an office right down the street. Most everything you need is within walking distance. Walking distance? In Manhattan, Margaret was used to traveling 20 blocks for a decent cup of coffee. Here, the entire business district could fit inside her apartment building's lobby. Is there a good hotel in town? She asked. We've got the Mountain View Inn about 2 miles out. Clean rooms, continental breakfast. Or if you're looking for something fancier, there's a resort about an hour's drive toward Billings. Margaret chose the local inn. She'd planned to finish everything in 2 days maximum and fly back to New York. Her assistant was already fielding calls from clients who couldn't understand why she'd left town during their busy season. As she left the bank, Margaret noticed the pace of life moving around her. People walked slower, talked longer, and seemed genuinely interested in each other's lives. It was foreign to her, almost unsettling. In New York, efficiency was everything. Here, relationships seemed to matter more than productivity. She drove to the Mountain View Inn, passing farms and ranches that stretched to the horizon. The landscape was undeniably beautiful, with rolling hills and snow-capped mountains in the distance. But beauty didn't pay the bills or advance careers. Her phone finally picked up a signal as she checked into the inn. Immediately, dozens of messages flooded in from her office. Client emergencies, campaign deadlines, meeting requests. The familiar stress settled back into her shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. Tomorrow, she'd start the process of settling Aunt Helen's estate and arranging to sell everything. Then she could return to her real life, where people wore proper business attire and understood the value of time. But as she looked out her hotel window at the vast Montana sky, Margaret couldn't shake the image of the quiet cowboy named Jake Morrison and the respect he commanded from everyone in that small bank. Margaret's second day in Cedar Ridge started with another frustration. The rental car made a strange clicking sound when she turned the key, and the engine barely started. She'd planned to drive out to Aunt Helen's property to assess what needed to be done before putting it on the market. Just what I need, she muttered, checking her phone for the nearest car rental office. The closest one was 60 miles away in Billings. Against her better judgment, she decided to risk the drive to her aunt's house. The car sputtered and complained but managed to get her there. The Victorian house sat on a small hill surrounded by tall pine trees, with a view of rolling meadows that stretched toward distant mountains. It was beautiful in a rustic way, but Margaret could already see the work needed. The porch steps sagged, paint peeled from the shutters, and the roof looked like it needed attention. She spent 2 hours making notes and taking photos, calculating repair costs in her head. The real problem started when she tried to leave. The car turned over once, then twice, then nothing. Just a clicking sound and silence. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, trying again. Still nothing. Margaret popped the hood and stared at the engine, knowing absolutely nothing about cars. In Manhattan, she used taxis, the subway, or ride-sharing apps. Car maintenance was something other people handled. She pulled out her phone. No signal. The house was 5 miles from town on a road that rarely saw traffic. She was completely stranded. After 20 minutes of growing panic, She heard the rumble of a truck approaching. Relief flooded through her until she saw who was driving. It was Jake Morrison, the cowboy from the bank, in an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades. He pulled over and rolled down his window. "Having trouble?" Margaret's pride warred with her desperation. She was used to solving her own problems, not depending on strangers, especially ones who probably thought city people were helpless. "The car won't start," she admitted reluctantly. Jake parked his truck and walked over, removing his worn baseball cap. Up close, she could see he was probably in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and laugh lines around his eyes. "Mind if I take a look?" She stepped aside, watching as he bent over the engine. His hands moved confidently among the parts, checking connections and fluid levels. Within minutes, he'd identified the problem. "Looks like your battery cable's come loose," he said, producing a small wrench from his truck. "Happens sometimes with rental cars. They don't always maintain them properly. Can you fix it?" "Should be able to." He worked quietly for a few minutes, tightening connections and checking other components. "There, try it now." Margaret turned the key, and the engine started immediately. She felt a rush of gratitude mixed with embarrassment. "Thank you so much. What do I owe you?" Jake wiped his hands on an old rag and shook his head. "Nothing, just being neighborly." "Please, let me pay you something. Or buy you lunch? Really, it's fine." Helen Morrison was good people. She helped plenty of folks around here over the years. Margaret studied his face, looking for some sign that he was expecting payment or trying to impress her. She found neither. His kindness seemed genuine, without any hidden agenda. "You knew my aunt?" Everyone knew Helen. She was the town librarian for 30 years before she retired. Smart as a whip and always willing to help kids with their homework or adults with research. This was news to Margaret. Her family had rarely spoken about Aunt Helen except in passing. They'd considered her the eccentric relative who'd chosen to live in the middle of nowhere. "I didn't know she was a librarian." "She had more books than the actual library," Jake said with a smile. "Used to loan them out to anyone who asked. She'd special order books for people if they wanted to learn about something specific." Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She'd been so focused on her career and city life that she'd never really gotten to know her aunt. Now it was too late. "She? Sounds like she was special." She was. "This whole town's going to miss her." Jake paused, then asked, "You planning to keep the house?" "Oh, no. I live in New York. I'm just here to settle the estate and sell everything." Something flickered across Jake's expression, but he just nodded. "Well, if you need any help with repairs or recommendations for contractors, most folks in town knew Helen and would want to help. That's kind of you to offer." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Margaret found herself noticing details about him, the way he held himself with quiet confidence, the intelligence in his eyes, the calluses on his hands that spoke of real work. "Can I ask you something?" she said impulsively. "At the bank yesterday, everyone seemed to really respect you. Are you some kind of foreman or ranch manager?" Jake's smile was enigmatic. "Something like that. My family's been ranching here for a long time." Betty mentioned the Morrison Ranch was one of the larger operations. "We managed to keep busy." He changed the subject smoothly. "How long are you planning to stay in town?" "Just a few more days. I need to handle the paperwork and get repair estimates for the house. If you're interested, I could show you around some. Help you understand why Helen loved this place so much." The offer surprised Margaret. She was used to men hitting on her, but this felt different. Jake seemed genuinely interested in helping her understand her aunt's life, not trying to impress her. "I don't want to take up your time. I've got time. Besides, Helen would have wanted someone to show you the good parts of Cedar Ridge." Margaret found herself curious about this quiet man who seemed so different from anyone she knew. "Okay, that would be nice. How about tomorrow evening? I could pick you up around 5, show you some of the prettier spots around here. It's a date." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she felt her cheeks warm. "I mean an appointment, a plan." Jake's grin was warm and genuine. "I knew what you meant." As he drove away, Margaret stood beside her aunt's house, watching his truck disappear down the dusty road. She couldn't remember the last time someone had helped her without expecting anything in return. In her world, every favor came with strings attached. Every kindness had an angle. But Jake Morrison seemed different. He'd fixed her car, refused payment, and offered to show her around town simply because it was the right thing to do. She found herself looking forward to tomorrow evening more than she wanted to admit. Back at the hotel that night, Margaret tried to focus on work emails, but her mind kept drifting to the encounter. There had been something about Jake's quiet confidence and genuine kindness that she couldn't shake. Maybe one evening of playing tourist wouldn't hurt. She could learn more about Aunt Helen and see what had kept her in this small town for so many years. Then she'd return to New York with a better understanding of the woman she'd never really known. What she didn't expect was how much one evening with a small-town cowboy might change her perspective on everything else. Margaret spent more time getting ready than she'd planned. She'd packed only business clothes for this trip, but somehow her simple black dress and light cardigan felt too formal for an evening with a cowboy. She settled on dark jeans and a soft blue sweater, hoping she looked casual enough for whatever Jake had in mind. At exactly 5 o'clock, she heard the rumble of his pickup truck outside the inn. Through her window, she watched him step out wearing clean jeans, boots, and a button-down shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. He traded his baseball cap for a cowboy hat that looked well-worn but cared for. "You look nice," he said when she met him in the lobby, his compliment simple and sincere. "Thank you." "So do you." Jake opened the passenger door of his truck for her, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and natural. The interior was clean but worn, with a bench seat covered in soft leather that had aged to a comfortable patina. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked as they drove out of town. "Thought I'd show you some of the places Helen loved most." She used to say people couldn't understand Cedar Ridge until they'd seen it from Eagle Point. The truck climbed a winding dirt road through stands of pine and aspen trees. Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the drive, something she never experienced in New York traffic. Here, there was no rushing, no honking horns, just the steady hum of the engine and the occasional bird call from the forest. "Tell me about your work," Jake said. "Betty mentioned you're in advertising, marketing actually. I help companies figure out how to sell their products. Create campaigns, develop brand strategies, that sort of thing." "Sounds challenging." "It is. Competitive too. You have to be quick, creative, and willing to work long hours." She paused. "What about ranching?" "I imagine that's challenging in different ways. Every day's different. Weather, animals, market prices, lots of variables you can't control. But there's something satisfying about working with the land, seeing the results of your efforts." They reached a clearing where Jake parked the truck. A short trail led to a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. Margaret could see for miles rolling hills dotted with cattle. The town of Cedar Ridge nestled among trees and mountains rising like purple shadows in the distance. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. "This is incredible." Helen came up here when she needed to think. Said it put everything in perspective. Margaret could understand why. The view was breathtaking, but more than that, it conveyed a sense of permanence and peace that was completely foreign to her fast-paced city life. "How did you know my aunt so well?" Jake leaned against a boulder, his expression thoughtful. "She helped me through some tough times when I was younger. My parents died in a car accident when I was 16. Helen stepped in, made sure I had support. Helped me figure out how to keep the ranch going. I'm so sorry, that must have been terribly difficult." It was. But Helen taught me that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can also teach us the most about what really matters. Margaret studied his profile as he gazed out over the valley. There was a depth to Jake Morrison that she hadn't expected. In her world, people wore their accomplishments like armor, constantly proving their worth. Jake's strength seemed to come from a quieter place. What did she teach you? That community matters more than individual success. That treating people with kindness and respect isn't just nice, it's essential. That the land will be here long after we're gone, so we better Take care of it while we can. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin to set behind the mountains. Margaret felt something shifting inside her, a loosening of the constant tension she carried. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why are you taking time to show me this? You barely know me." Jake turned to look at her directly. "Because Helen cared about you. She talked about her successful niece in New York, worried that you worked too hard and didn't take time to enjoy life. She would have wanted someone to help you understand why she chose this place. She worried about me? She said you reminded her of herself when she was young, driven, ambitious, always focused on the next goal. But she found something here that she couldn't find anywhere else." "What was that?" "Peace, purpose, a connection to something bigger than herself." As they walked back to the truck, Margaret found herself asking questions about ranch life, local history, and Jake's family. His answers revealed a deep knowledge not just of practical matters, but of literature, history, and current events. He'd read many of the same books she had, could discuss politics without getting heated, and had thoughtful opinions about everything from environmental policy to economic trends. "You seem to know a lot about a wide range of subjects," she observed. Helen's influence. She believed everyone should be well-read, regardless of their profession. "I spent a lot of time in her library growing up." "Did you go to college?" "State University in Bozeman. Studied business and agricultural science. Came back home afterward." "Did you ever think about leaving, seeing what else was out there?" And Jake was quiet for a moment. "I traveled some in college, spent a summer working in Denver. But this is home. This land, these people, they're part of who I am." Margaret couldn't imagine such rootedness. She'd moved from her childhood home to college to New York without looking back, always focused on the next opportunity, the next level of success. They stopped for dinner at a small restaurant outside town, a family-owned place with checkered tablecloths and food that tasted like it was made with care rather than speed. Jake knew the owners, asked about their daughter's college plans and their elderly father's health. "You really do know everyone," Margaret said. "Small community. People look out for each other. Is it ever limiting? Being so connected to everyone's business? Sometimes. But when times get tough, you know you're not facing it alone?" Over dinner, their conversation flowed easily. Jake asked thoughtful questions about her work, her life in New York, her goals. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding her world, even though it was so different from his own. "Don't you get tired of the pace?" he asked. "Always being on, always competing?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but it's exciting too. Every day brings new challenges, new opportunities." "What happens when you achieve all your goals?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on climbing the ladder that she'd never thought about what came after reaching the top. "I guess you set new goals. But what's the end point? What are you working toward?" Margaret realized she didn't have a good answer. Success, recognition, financial security, but to what end? In Jake's world, the purpose seemed clearer. Take care of the land, support the community, build something lasting. As he drove her back to the inn, Margaret felt reluctant for the evening to end. She'd enjoyed herself more than she had in months, maybe years. The conversation had been stimulating without being competitive, the pace relaxed without being boring. "Thank you for showing me Eagle Point," she said as they pulled up to the inn. "And for dinner, it was really lovely. Would you like to see more tomorrow? I could show you some of the historical sites, maybe take you riding if you're interested." "Riding? Horses?" Helen used to love trail riding. Said it was the best way to see the country. Margaret had never been on a horse in her life, but something about the way Jake suggested it made her want to try. "I'd like that, though I should warn you, I'm a complete beginner. The best kind, no bad habits to unlearn." As she watched him drive away, Margaret realized she was already looking forward to tomorrow. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about work deadlines or career strategies. She was thinking about a quiet cowboy who read poetry and understood the value of taking time to watch the sunset. Maybe staying in Cedar Ridge for a few extra days wouldn't hurt her career as much as she'd thought. Maybe there were some things worth slowing down for. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's planned 2-day trip to Cedar Ridge. She'd extended her stay twice, telling her boss she needed more time to handle complex estate matters. The truth was more complicated. She wasn't ready to leave Jake. And the surprising peace she'd found in this small town, they'd spent nearly every evening together. Jake had taught her to ride horses, shown her hidden waterfalls, and introduced her to local families who shared stories about Aunt Helen. Margaret discovered her aunt had been beloved in ways her family never understood, a woman who'd chosen community over ambition and found deep satisfaction in that choice, but her extended absence hadn't gone unnoticed in New York. Her assistant fielded increasingly urgent calls from clients, and her boss grew impatient with her remote work arrangement. When her best friend Carolyn announced she was flying out to rescue Margaret from her obvious breakdown, Margaret knew her peaceful interlude was about to end. Carolyn arrived with 2 other friends from their elite social circle, Victoria, a successful lawyer, and Amanda, who managed her family's investment portfolio. They checked into the Mountain View Inn like they were entering enemy territory, clearly horrified by the small-town accommodations. "Darling, what are you doing to yourself?" Carolyn said over lunch at the local diner. "When you missed the Henderson charity gala and didn't return my calls, I knew something was wrong." "Nothing's wrong. I'm just taking some time to handle family business." "For 3 weeks? In this place?" Victoria gestured dismissively at their surroundings. "There's nothing here but farms and people who don't even dress properly." Margaret bristled at the comment. Over the past week, she'd come to appreciate Cedar Ridge's unpretentious atmosphere. People here valued character over appearance, substance over style. "The people here are kind and genuine." "Oh no," Amanda said with dramatic flair. "You've gone native. I've heard about this happening to city people. The fresh air and quiet start affecting their judgment." Their conversation was interrupted when Jake entered the diner. He'd been working cattle all morning, and his clothes showed honest dirt and sweat. When he spotted Margaret, his face lit up with a warm smile that made her heart skip. "Hey there," he said, approaching their table. "How's your day going?" "Good, Jake. I'd like you to meet my friends from New York. Carolyn, Victoria, Amanda. This is Jake Morrison." Jake politely removed his hat and nodded to each woman. "Nice to meet you all. Hope you're enjoying your visit to Cedar Ridge." Margaret's friends exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Caroline's smile was politely frozen. Victoria looked Jake up and down like he was something unpleasant she'd stepped in, and Amanda barely managed a nod. "We're just passing through," Victoria said coolly. "Well, if you need any recommendations for places to visit, I'd be happy to help. This area has some beautiful scenery." "Thank you, but we prefer more sophisticated entertainment," Carolyn replied with barely concealed disdain. Jake's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He recognized the dismissal for what it was, of course. "Well, Margaret, I'll let you visit with your friends. Give me a call later if you'd like." After he left, the judgment came swift and harsh. "Margaret, please tell me you're not seriously involved with that." "Ranch hand," Carolyn said, her voice dripping with horror. "He's a good man." "He's a cowboy with dirt under his fingernails," Victoria snapped. "Do you realize how this looks? You're a successful executive dating someone who probably didn't finish high school. Actually, he went to college and he's very intelligent." "Intelligence is relative," Amanda said dismissively. "What could you possibly have in common with someone like that?" Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. These women had been her closest friends for years, but their snobbery and casual cruelty suddenly seemed unbearable. "He's kind, thoughtful, and treats me with more respect than most of the men in our social circle." "Respect?" Carolyn laughed. "Honey, he's probably just impressed by your success and money." "Men like that always are. You don't know anything about him?" "I know enough. This is classic rebound behavior after your breakup with Richard. You're acting out, trying to prove something by slumming it with the locals." The mention of Richard Blackstone made Margaret wince. Her ex-boyfriend was everything her social circle admired: wealthy family, Ivy League education, partnership track at a prestigious law firm. He was also shallow, self-centered, and had cheated on her with his secretary. This has nothing to do with Richard, doesn't it? You disappear to the middle of nowhere and start dating a cowboy right after ending things with one of the most eligible bachelors in Manhattan. It screams emotional crisis. Over the next 2 days, Margaret's friends conducted what they called an intervention. They criticized everything about Cedar Ridge: the slow pace, the simple people, the lack of culture and sophistication. They mocked Jake openly, calling him her pet cowboy and making jokes about riding into the sunset. The worst part was how their attitude affected her. After weeks of feeling relaxed and content, Margaret found herself seeing Cedar Ridge through their critical eyes. The town did seem small and unsophisticated compared to Manhattan. Jake's simple clothes and modest truck looked shabby next to the luxury her friends took for granted. When photos of Margaret at the local county fair with Jake surfaced on social media, the mockery intensified. Someone had tagged her in pictures of them sharing cotton candy and watching the rodeo. Within hours, her phone buzzed with texts from New York acquaintances. "Is this really you at a county fair? Who's the cowboy? New hobby. Hope you're getting this rustic phase out of your system." The comments on the photos were even worse. People from her professional and social circles made snide remarks about Margaret's midlife crisis and going native in Montana, her ex-boyfriend. Richard posted a particularly cruel comment. "Always knew you had simple tastes, but this is a new low." Carolyn showed her the post with mock concern. "Darling, people are talking. This is becoming embarrassing. Your reputation is suffering." "My reputation? Professional reputation? Personal reputation? People think you've lost your mind. Some clients are asking if you're having personal problems that might affect your work." That hit Margaret where it hurt most. She'd worked too hard to build her career to let personal choices damage her professional standing. Victoria piled on ruthlessly. "You're a successful Manhattan executive. You drive a BMW, wear designer clothes, and close million-dollar deals. What are you doing wasting time with a man who probably makes less in a year than you spend on shoes? Money isn't everything." "No, but compatibility is. You come from different worlds." "What happens when the novelty wears off? When you remember that you're educated, sophisticated, and ambitious while he's not?" Amanda delivered the final blow. "Your family is mortified. Your mother called me asking if you were having a nervous breakdown. Your father is threatening to have a serious conversation with you about family expectations." Margaret knew. Her parents would be horrified. The Wellington family had social standing to maintain. They'd already been embarrassed by her breakup with Richard, and dating a small-town cowboy would be seen as a complete social disaster that evening. When Jake came to pick her up for dinner, Margaret felt the weight of her friend's judgment crushing down on her. For the first time since she'd met him, she found herself noticing their differences: his work-worn hands against her manicured nails, his simple truck compared to her friend's luxury cars, his straightforward manner versus the sophisticated conversation she was used to. "You seem quiet tonight," Jake observed as they drove toward his favorite restaurant. "My friends have some strong opinions about us." I gathered that from the way they looked at me. Like I was something they'd scrape off their shoes. Margaret winced at his accurate assessment. "They don't understand." "Do you?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret realized she was no longer sure what she understood about anything. Her comfortable assumptions about success, relationships, and what mattered in life had been shaken by 3 weeks in Cedar Ridge, but her friend's criticism had awakened old insecurities and social pressures she thought she'd moved past. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Jake nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. Margaret could see him withdrawing, protecting himself from the inevitable hurt that was coming. The thought of losing him made her chest tight with panic, but the thought of facing continued mockery from her entire social and professional world felt equally terrifying. She was caught between two worlds, and increasingly unsure which one was really hers. The morning after her friends left Cedar Ridge, Margaret sat in her hotel room staring at her laptop screen. 27 emails demanded her immediate attention. 3 clients threatened to find new agencies if she didn't return soon, and her boss had scheduled a career discussion for the following week, but it wasn't the work pressure that kept her awake at night. It was the memory of Jake's face when she'd hesitated to answer his question about understanding their relationship. She'd seen something close to resignation in his eyes, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. Her phone rang. Caroline's name appeared on the screen. "Thank goodness you're answering," Caroline said without preamble. "I was worried you'd gone completely off the grid. Listen, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to apologize if we seemed harsh." "Seemed harsh?" "We're just concerned about you. This whole situation is so unlike you, and people are starting to talk. Richard mentioned you at the Parkers' dinner party last night." Margaret's stomach turned. "What did he say?" "Nothing terrible. Just wondered if you were having some kind of personal crisis." He seemed concerned. The lie was transparent. Richard had never been concerned about anyone but himself. "I'm fine, Caroline." "Are you, though? Really? You've been gone for almost a month, dating a man who has nothing in common with you, living in a town that doesn't even have a decent restaurant. When was the last time you went to the theater, or a gallery opening, or had a proper conversation about anything that matters? Jake and I have wonderful conversations. About what? Cattle prices and weather patterns?" The dismissive tone finally pushed Margaret past her breaking point. "About books, philosophy, environmental policy, history, art. He's more well-read than most people in our social circle. He just doesn't feel the need to show off about it." "Margaret, listen to yourself. You're defending a cowboy against people who've known you for years. This isn't who you are." "Maybe it is who I am. Maybe I've been pretending to be someone else for so long that I forgot." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. "I think you need to talk to someone," Caroline said finally. "A professional. This kind of dramatic personality change isn't normal." Margaret hung up without saying goodbye. An hour later, her mother called. "Margaret, darling, Caroline told me about your situation in Montana. I think you need to come home immediately." "Mother, I'm handling Aunt Helen's estate." "For a month? How complicated could it be?" She was a small-town librarian, not a business mogul. Margaret bristled at the dismissive tone. She was a respected member of her community who made a real difference in people's lives. "That's very nice, dear, but she's gone now and you have a life to get back to, a real life. Your father is very concerned about these stories circulating about you and some local man." "What stories?" "Richard showed us some photographs from social media. You at what appeared to be a county fair with a rather rustic gentleman. Your father nearly had apoplexy." Margaret could picture her parents' horror. The Wellington family had spent generations building their social position. Her mother lived for charity galas and society pages, while her father networked constantly to maintain their status in New York's elite circles. "I'm an adult, Mother. I can date whoever I choose. Not if you want to remain part of this family. You can't. We have a reputation to maintain. Your grandfather didn't build the Wellington name so you could throw it away on some cowboy. His name is Jake Morrison, and he's a good man. I'm sure he's perfectly nice for what he is. But he's not suitable for you, and this little rebellion has gone on long enough." Margaret felt the familiar weight of family expectations settling on her shoulders. Growing up, every choice had been evaluated based on how it would reflect on the family name. Schools, friends, career path, even romantic relationships, all had to meet Wellington standards. What if I'm happy? Happiness is temporary, darling. Security and social position last. Come home, end this foolishness, and we'll help you repair any damage to your reputation. That afternoon, Margaret drove out to the Morrison Ranch to find Jake. She needed to talk to him, to explain the pressure she was under, to somehow make him understand why everything suddenly felt so complicated. She found him working on fence repairs in a pasture, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cool mountain air. When he saw her approaching, he straightened and wiped his hands on his jeans. "This is a nice surprise," he said, but she could hear the careful note in his voice. "I wanted to apologize for last night. My friends—" "They don't understand what?" I've found here. And what have you found? Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. Jake Morrison was everything her friends and family would consider unsuitable. He worked with his hands, lived simply, and seemed content with a life that included no ambition for wealth or status. But he was also kind, intelligent, principled, and treated her with a respect and genuine care she'd never experienced before. Peace, she said finally, purpose, a connection to something real. But they're right about one thing. We come from very different worlds. Jake leaned against the fence post, his expression carefully neutral. That we do. Everyone I know thinks I've lost my mind. My family is threatening to disown me. My career is suffering because people think I'm having some kind of breakdown. And what do you think? Margaret took a deep breath. I think for the first time in my adult life, I've found something worth fighting for. Something shifted in Jake's eyes. Even if it costs you everything else? Maybe everything else wasn't worth as much as I thought. Margaret, I need you too. Be sure about this, really sure. Because if you're going to wake up in 6 months and realize you made a mistake, if you're going to resent me for what you gave up, then we should end this now. His words cut through all the noise and pressure from her old life. This wasn't about her friends' approval or her family's expectations or her professional reputation. This was about choosing between the life she'd built and the life she'd discovered. I don't want to end this. Even knowing it means disappointing people you care about? The people who truly care about me would want me to be happy. Jake studied her face for a long moment, then reached out to touch her cheek gently. It won't be easy. Your friends will keep trying to change your mind. Your family will keep applying pressure. I know. And I can't promise you the kind of excitement and sophistication you're used to. I don't want that anymore. I want what we have. That evening, Margaret called her boss and requested an extended leave of absence. She called her parents and told them she was staying in Montana indefinitely. She changed her social media settings to private and stopped responding. To texts from her New York social circle, the responses were swift and harsh. Her boss informed her that her position would not be held indefinitely. Her mother hung up on her. Her father had his attorney send a formal letter outlining the financial consequences of bringing shame to the family name. But as Margaret watched the sunset from Jake's front porch that night, his arm around her shoulders and the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them, she realized she'd never felt more certain of a decision in her life. Any regrets? Jake asked quietly. Only that it took me so long to figure out what really matters. And what's that? This, you building something real with someone who sees me for who I actually am, not who I'm supposed to be. Jake pulled her closer, and Margaret finally understood what Aunt Helen had found in this small town. It wasn't the absence of ambition or sophistication. It was the presence of something more valuable, authentic connection, genuine community, and the freedom to be yourself without apology. Her old life might not understand, but that was their loss, not hers. 2 months into her extended stay in Cedar Ridge, Margaret had settled into a routine that felt more natural than any life she'd known in Manhattan. She'd rented a small apartment above the town's bookstore, found freelance marketing work she could do remotely, and spent her evenings with Jake exploring the wilderness that surrounded their small community. But it was during a routine town council meeting that Margaret first noticed something didn't quite add up about Jake's position. In the community, she'd attended the meeting to learn about local development plans that might affect Aunt Helen's property. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, with folding chairs arranged in rows and a simple podium at the front. About 60 residents attended, a significant turnout for a town of Cedar Ridge's size. Margaret took a seat in the back, content to observe local politics in action. The mayor, a friendly woman named Patricia who ran the hardware store, called the meeting to order and began discussing routine business, road maintenance, library funding, permits for the upcoming Harvest Festival. Then the conversation turned to a proposed development project. A company from Denver wanted to build a luxury resort on a large tract of land just outside town. The project would bring jobs and tourist dollars, but also significantly changed the character of Cedar Ridge. Before we discuss this further, Mayor Patricia said, I think we should hear from Jake. This project would affect the Morrison Holdings more than anyone else's. Margaret expected Jake to stand from his seat among the other ranchers. Instead, murmurs rippled through the crowd as people turned expectantly toward the front of the room. Jake walked from the back to the podium with the easy confidence she'd come to know, but something about the way everyone watched him struck her as unusual. Thanks, Patricia, Jake said, removing his hat. I appreciate everyone coming out tonight to discuss this. The room fell completely silent. Margaret had never seen a group of people so focused on a single speaker. In town council meetings she'd attended in other places, residents chatted quietly, checked their phones, or showed other signs of impatience. Here, everyone listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for major announcements. As most of you know, Jake continued, the proposed resort site borders Morrison Ranch land on 3 sides. While I'm not opposed to development that benefits our community, I have some concerns about this particular project. Margaret leaned forward, intrigued by the deference everyone showed Jake. She'd assumed his family owned a mid-sized ranch, but the way people hung on his words suggested something more significant. The environmental impact study shows potential issues with water rights and wildlife corridors, Jake said, referencing a thick folder of documents. I've had my attorneys review the proposal, and there are some questions about long-term sustainability. His attorneys? Margaret filed that detail away with growing curiosity. Jake spoke for 15 minutes about water tables, wildlife migration patterns, and environmental regulations. His knowledge was incredibly detailed, and he referenced studies and legal precedents with the fluency of someone who clearly spent significant time researching the issue. But what struck Margaret most was how the room responded. When Jake expressed concerns, others nodded seriously. When he suggested modifications to the proposal, people took notes. When he finished speaking, the mayor asked if anyone had questions for him, not about his concerns, but about his recommendations. Jake, if they agreed to your suggested environmental safeguards, would you support the project? Asked Tom, who owned the local feed store. With those modifications, yes. It could be good for Cedar Ridge if done responsibly. That's good enough for me, Tom said, and several other residents murmured agreement. Margaret watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. Jake spoke like someone accustomed to having his opinions carry significant weight. People deferred to his judgment on complex legal and environmental issues. Most puzzling of all, the mayor treated him like a co-equal rather than just another concerned citizen. After the meeting, Margaret walked outside with Jake, her mind spinning with questions. That was interesting, she said carefully. Pretty typical for a council meeting. Development proposals always stir up discussion. Everyone seemed very interested in your opinion. Jake shrugged. Ranchers have to stay informed about environmental issues. Our livelihoods depend on land and water management. It was a reasonable explanation, but something nagged at Margaret. Jake's knowledge went beyond general environmental awareness. He'd spoken about complex legal issues and referenced attorneys as if consulting them was routine. Over the following weeks, Margaret began noticing other inconsistencies. When they went horseback riding, Jake always took her to what he called family land, but they never seemed to reach the boundaries. They'd ride for hours through varying terrain, meadows, forests, creek valleys, and it was all Morrison property. At the bank, Betty always greeted Jake with special warmth and immediately attended to his business, no matter how busy she was with other customers. When the local mechanic fixed Jake's truck, he refused payment, saying Jake had helped out his family during a difficult time. Most telling was the way other ranchers treated Jake. Margaret attended a local cattlemen's association meeting with him and watched grown men seek his advice on everything from cattle breeding to land management to market timing. They spoke to him with the respect usually reserved for industry leaders. How big is your family's ranch? Margaret asked one evening, as they sat on his porch. Big enough to keep us busy, Jake replied with his characteristic modesty. But how big exactly? Hundreds of acres? Thousands? Jake was quiet for a moment. Land ownership is complicated around here. Family holdings, leased grazing rights, partnerships. With other ranchers, it's not really about size anyway, it's about stewardship. Again, a reasonable answer that somehow avoided answering her question. Margaret's curiosity intensified when she overheard a conversation at the grocery store. Two women were discussing their son's college plans, and one mentioned that Jake Morrison had offered to help with tuition if they needed assistance. "That's so generous," the other woman said. "But then the Morrisons have always looked out for people in this community. Ever since Jake's grandfather started the scholarship fund, their families helped dozens of kids get through college." Scholarship fund? Margaret had never heard Jake mention anything about college scholarships or charitable giving. She was beginning to realize there was much about Jake Morrison that he hadn't shared. That weekend, Jake invited her to a neighboring ranch for a barbecue. The Hendersons were celebrating their daughter's engagement, and half the county had been invited. Margaret enjoyed meeting more local families and hearing their stories about life in Cedar Ridge, but she couldn't help noticing how people interacted with Jake. Men who owned substantial ranches themselves sought his advice on business decisions. Women thanked him for help he'd provided their families during difficult times. Even the county sheriff made a point of discussing local issues with Jake, as if his input mattered for official decisions. "Jake's really something special, isn't he?" said Helen Henderson, the hostess, as she and Margaret watched Jake help organize games for the children. "He is," Margaret agreed. "Everyone seems to think very highly of him." "Well, of course they do. The Morrison family built half this county. Jake's grandfather started the bank. His father established the volunteer fire department. And Jake himself has kept more families from losing their farms than anyone wants to count." Margaret felt a chill of realization. "What do you mean about keeping families from losing their farms?" "Oh, you know how it is. Bad weather, poor crop yields, medical emergencies. Sometimes good people just need help getting through tough times. Jake's always been there when folks need assistance." "That single quotes s. Very generous of him." Helen gave her a curious look. "Generous, yes, but also just good business sense. Strong communities benefit everyone. Good business sense. As if Jake were running a business significant enough that community stability affected his bottom line." That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about all the small details that didn't quite fit her understanding of Jake Morrison. The deference people showed him, his detailed knowledge of complex issues, his apparent ability to help struggling families financially, the way business owners and local officials sought his input on important decisions. She'd fallen in love with a man she thought was a simple ranch hand who happened to be well-read and community-minded. But the evidence suggested Jake Morrison was something much more significant than he'd let her believe. The question was, what exactly was he hiding? And why? Margaret's growing suspicions finally drove her to do something she'd never imagined. She decided to investigate the man she'd fallen in love with. The realization that Jake might be hiding something significant from her felt like a betrayal, but her need to know the truth outweighed her guilt about prying. She started at the courthouse, telling herself she was simply researching property records for her aunt's estate. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Patterson, was happy to help Margaret navigate the filing system. "Just pull any property records you need, dear," Mrs. Patterson said. "Everything's organized by landowner name or legal description." Margaret started with her aunt's property records, then casually asked to see other holdings in the area. When she requested information about Morrison family properties, Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That'll be quite a stack of documents, honey." The Morrison holdings are extensive. "How extensive?" "Well, let's see, Mrs. Patterson pulled out a thick ledger and ran her finger down several pages. "Looks like approximately 112,000 acres currently under Morrison ownership, plus another 30,000 in long-term leases." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. 112,000 acres, give or take. That includes ranch land, timber holdings, mineral rights, and water rights. The Morrison Ranch is one of the largest private holdings in this part of Montana. 112,000 acres. Margaret's mind struggled to process the numbers. That was larger than some cities. In terms of land ownership, Jake Morrison wasn't just a successful rancher, he was controlling an empire. Could I see those records? Mrs. Patterson pulled out file after file, each one documenting different aspects of Morrison family holdings. As Margaret reviewed the documents, a picture emerged that shattered every assumption she'd made about Jake's circumstances. The Morrison Ranch wasn't just large, it was valuable beyond anything she'd imagined. The property included some of the most fertile agricultural land in the state, vast timber reserves, and significant mineral rights. Water rights alone were worth millions in the arid West, but the real shock came when she found the incorporation. Papers for Morrison Holdings, LLC. Jake wasn't just inheriting family land, he was the CEO of a diversified corporation that included ranching operations, timber harvesting, mineral extraction, and real estate development. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said, her voice barely steady, "what can you tell me about the Morrison families? Financial situation?" The older woman looked around conspiratorially, then leaned closer. "Well, I probably shouldn't gossip, but it's not exactly a secret. The Morrisons are probably the wealthiest family in the county, maybe in the whole region. Jake's great-grandfather started buying land during the Depression when prices were low. Smart man. Every generation since has been good with business and careful with money." "How wealthy are we talking about?" "Hard to say exactly, but with land values what they are these days, plus the timber and mineral rights, I'd guess somewhere in the hundreds of millions. Maybe more." Margaret sat in stunned silence, staring at documents that completely redefined her understanding of the man she'd been dating. Jake Morrison wasn't a simple cowboy who happened to be well-read and community-minded. He was one of the wealthiest landowners in Montana, possibly one of the richest men in the entire state. She spent the rest of the afternoon researching, finding more evidence of Jake's true circumstances. Morrison Holdings had subsidiaries, investments, and business partnerships that stretched across the western United States. The company employed dozens of people directly and supported hundreds more through various ventures. Most surprisingly, the Morrison family had a long history of philanthropy that was carefully kept out of the public eye. The scholarship fund Helen Henderson had mentioned was just one of several charitable initiatives funded by Morrison money. They quietly supported the local hospital, funded infrastructure improvements, and helped struggling families during economic downturns. By the time Margaret left the courthouse, she felt like she'd been living in a completely false reality. The modest ranch house where Jake lived, his old pickup truck, his simple clothes, all of it was apparently a choice, not a necessity. He could afford any luxury he wanted, yet he chose to live simply and work his own land. That evening, when Jake came to pick her up for dinner, Margaret studied him with new eyes. His clothes were indeed simple, but now she noticed they were well made and perfectly fitted. His truck was old, but it was meticulously maintained and running perfectly. Even his modest ranch house, she realized, sat on land worth millions of dollars. "You're quiet tonight," Jake observed as they drove toward their favorite restaurant. "I've been thinking about some things. Want to talk about it?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I went to the courthouse today to research property records." Jake's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but his expression didn't change. "Find what you were looking for." "More than I was looking for." She watched his profile carefully. "Jake, why didn't you tell me who you really are?" For a long moment, the only sound was the rumble of the truck's engine. Finally, Jake pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face her. "What did you find out?" "That you own over 100,000 acres of land. That you're the CEO of a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That you're probably one of the wealthiest men in Montana." Jake was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountain landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "Did that change how you feel about me?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd been so focused on feeling deceived that she hadn't considered her deeper emotions. "I don't know. I'm confused. Why would you hide something like this?" "Because of exactly what you're feeling right now. Confusion, doubt. About my motives. Questions about whether anything between us was real." But lying by omission isn't exactly honest either. You're right. Jake turned to look at her directly. I should have told you. But Margaret, think about what your reaction would have been. If I'd introduced myself as one of the wealthiest landowners in the state, Margaret considered this honestly. If she'd known about Jake's wealth from the beginning, would she have given him a chance? Or would she have assumed he was just another rich man looking for a sophisticated city girlfriend? I don't know, she admitted. I've had relationships before where women were interested in what I owned rather than who I am. I wanted to know if you could care about Jake Morrison the person, not Jake Morrison the property owner. So you tested me? I got to know you, the real you. Just like you got to know the real me. Margaret felt a flash of anger. The real you? You've been pretending to be someone you're not, have I? Jake's voice was gentle but firm. I work my own land every day. I live simply because I choose to, not because I have to. I care about this community and try to help when I can. Everything. You've seen about my character, my values, my feelings for you. All of that is real. But you're rich, incredibly rich. That changes things. Does it? Does it change how I treat you? Does it change our conversations, our connection, the way we feel when we're together? Margaret wanted to say yes, but she couldn't. The Jake she'd fallen in love with was sitting right beside her, the same kind eyes, the same gentle strength, the same genuine care for her well-being. The money didn't change any of those qualities? I feel like I don't know you at all, she said quietly. You know me better than anyone ever has. The wealth is just details, Margaret. Numbers on bank statements and legal documents. What matters is what we've built together. Those are pretty significant details to leave out. You're right. I should have told you sooner. I was scared of losing what we have. Margaret sat in the growing darkness, trying to process everything she'd learned. The man she'd fallen in love with was essentially the same person, but the context of his life was completely different than she'd understood. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Jake nodded slowly. I understand, and Margaret, whatever you decide, I want you to know that every moment we've spent together has been genuine. You've never been a game or a test to me. You've been the best thing that's happened in my life. As they drove back to town in silence, Margaret realized she was facing a different kind of choice than she'd thought. It wasn't about choosing between wealth and simplicity, or between sophisticated and modest lifestyles. It was about choosing whether to trust the connection they'd built, regardless of the circumstances that surrounded it. Margaret spent 3 days avoiding Jake's calls while she wrestled with everything she'd discovered. She walked the streets of Cedar Ridge, sat by the creek behind her aunt's house, and tried to understand her own feelings about the truth she'd uncovered. The revelation that Jake was extraordinarily wealthy had initially made her feel deceived and confused. But as the shock wore off, Margaret began to see the situation more clearly. Every quality that had drawn her to Jake, his kindness, intelligence, integrity, and genuine care for others, remained exactly the same. The only thing that had changed was her understanding of his circumstances. On the 4th day, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of calling Jake, she drove to New York City. She walked into her old office building wearing jeans and boots, feeling like a visitor to her former life. Her colleagues stared as she made her way to her old office, where her replacement, an ambitious young executive named David, was already settled behind her desk. Margaret! Her former boss, Charles, looked genuinely surprised to see her. We heard you were taking extended leave in Montana. How are you? I'm well, Charles. Very well, actually. When are you planning to return? David's doing fine as interim, but clients have been asking about you. Margaret looked around the office where she'd spent so many hours chasing success that now seemed hollow. I'm not coming back, Charles. I'm resigning permanently. The shock on Charles's face was almost comical. Resigning? Margaret, you're one of our most promising executives. You have a real future here. I have a real future somewhere else. Afternoon, Margaret met Carolyn, Victoria, and Amanda at their usual upscale restaurant. She'd called them specifically to have this conversation on their territory, in front of witnesses from their social circle. Darling, you look. Carolyn paused, clearly trying to find a diplomatic way to comment on Margaret's casual clothes and relaxed demeanor. Different. I feel different. Better. So you're finally coming to your senses? Victoria asked hopefully. Ready to put this cowboy phase behind you? Margaret smiled calmly. Actually, I called you here to tell you that I'm moving to Montana permanently. Jake asked me to marry him, and I said yes. The silence at their table was deafening. Other diners turned to look at the source of the suddenly frozen conversation. You cannot be serious, Amanda finally whispered. Completely serious. Margaret, this is insane, Carolyn said, her voice rising. You're throwing away everything you've worked for to marry a ranch hand in the middle of nowhere. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing something better. Better? Victoria's voice dripped with disbelief. What could possibly be better about that life? Margaret had rehearsed this moment, but now she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from her prepared speech. Authentic love. Real partnership. A connection with someone who values me for who I am, not what I can do for his social standing or career. Peace, purpose, a community where people genuinely care about each other. And poverty, Amanda added viciously. Don't forget about that. Actually, Margaret said quietly, that's where you're all wrong. She pulled out copies of the documents she'd found at the courthouse and placed them on the table. Her friends leaned forward to examine them, and she watched their expressions change from smugness to confusion to shock. What ... Carolyn asked, staring at the property records. Evidence that Jake Morrison owns over 100,000 acres of prime Montana real estate. He's the CEO of a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He's probably wealthier than anyone in this restaurant. The color drained from Victoria's face. This can't be right. It's completely right. The man you dismissed as an unsuitable ranch hand is one of the richest men in Montana. But that's not why I'm marrying him. Margaret leaned back in her chair, enjoying their stunned silence. I'm marrying him because he's kind, intelligent, and treats me with genuine respect. Because he makes me laugh and challenges me to think differently about what matters in life. Because when I'm with him, I feel like the best version of myself. But he looks like ... Amanda struggled for words. Like a man who chooses to live simply despite having unlimited resources. Like someone who works with his hands because he loves the land, not because he has to. Like a person who values character over appearance. Margaret gathered the documents and stood up. You judged Jake based on his clothes and his truck. You never bothered to learn about his intelligence, his education, his business acumen, or his genuine kindness. That says more about your character than his. Margaret, wait, Carolyn called out desperately. If he's really that wealthy, then maybe we were too hasty in our judgment. Now you're interested? Now that you know he has money? Margaret shook her head. That's exactly why he doesn't advertise his wealth. He wanted to be loved for who he is, not what he owns. But surely, you can understand why we were concerned, Victoria said weakly. I understand that you're shallow, judgmental people who care more about appearances than substance. I'm ashamed that it took me this long to see it. That evening, Margaret called her parents from her hotel room. The conversation was even more difficult than she'd anticipated. A cowboy? Her mother said, her voice faint with horror. Margaret. The Wellington name ... will be just fine, Mother? Especially when you learn that Jake Morrison is probably wealthier than our entire family. She explained Jake's true circumstances, watching her parents' attitudes shift in real time from horror to confusion to sudden interest. Well, her father said slowly, if he's really that well-established financially ... then you approve, now that you know he has money? It's not just about money, darling, her mother said, backtracking quickly. It's about compatibility, social standing ... social standing? Mother, he owns more land than some small countries. His family has been prominent in Montana for 4 generations. What more social standing could you want? The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The same people who'd mocked her choice now wanted to claim credit for her good fortune. 2 days later, Margaret returned to Cedar Ridge and drove straight to Jake's ranch. She found him working in the barn, and when he saw her, his face lit up with hope and uncertainty. "How was New York?" he asked carefully. "Enlightening. I told everyone about us. About your real circumstances." Jake's expression grew wary. "How did they react?" "Exactly as you'd expect. Suddenly everyone thinks I'm brilliant for choosing you." "And how does that make you feel?" Margaret walked closer to him, studying his face. "It makes me realize that you were right to hide your wealth. Initially. It makes me grateful that I fell in love with Jake Morrison the man, not Jake Morrison the millionaire." Relief flooded Jake's features. "So where does that leave us?" "It leaves us exactly where we were before I knew about your money. Two people who found something real together. Even though I should have told you sooner." "Even though you should have told me sooner," Margaret smiled. "But I understand why you didn't, and I'm glad you didn't actually." "Why?" "Because I got to discover that I could fall in love with someone, based purely on who they are. I learned that I could be happy with a simple life and that kindness and integrity matter more than wealth or status." Jake pulled her into his arms. "And now?" "Now, I know that whether you were a struggling ranch hand or the richest man in Montana, I'd still choose you. I'd still want to build a life with you, even if it means giving up your old life permanently." Margaret thought about her former friends, their shocked faces when they learned the truth. She thought about her parents, suddenly eager to meet the son-in-law they'd been ready to disown. She thought about her colleagues who would never understand, choosing love over career advancement, especially because it means giving up my old life. "I don't want to go back to caring about things that don't matter. I want to stay here with you and build something real." Jake's smile was radiant. "In that case, Margaret Wellington, will you marry me for real this time, with no secrets between us?" "Yes, Jake Morrison. Wealthy landowner, simple cowboy, or anything in between, yes." Their wedding 6 months later was everything Margaret's old life would have criticized and everything her new life celebrated. It was held outdoors on Morrison land, with mountains as a backdrop and the whole community in attendance. Margaret wore a simple dress instead of an elaborate gown, and the reception featured local barbecue instead of caviar and champagne. Her parents came, of course, now eager to be associated with the Morrison family name and fortune. Carolyn, Victoria, and Amanda attended too. Their attitudes completely reversed now that they understood Jake's true status, but Margaret barely noticed their presence. She was too busy celebrating with people who had welcomed her into their community based on her character, not her connections. People who had loved Jake Morrison long before they knew or cared about his bank account. As she danced with her new husband under the Montana stars, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd been mocked for falling in love with a simple cowboy, but she'd discovered something her critics never could have imagined. True love wasn't about matching social status or impressive resumes. It was about finding someone who saw your authentic self and cherished it. Someone who challenged you to be better while loving you exactly as you are.